Okay, so the claim I'm responding to today is drilling in Anwar, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, will have a minimal effect on the environment. So my opponent's secondary claims were, number one, the land needed for the proposed drilling site is a small fraction of Anwar as a whole. Number two, oil drilling will have a negligible effect on wildlife in Anwar. And number three, technological improvements to machinery significantly reduces the amount of pollution that is emitted into the environment. So back to number one, the land needed for the proposed drilling site is a small fraction of Anwar as a whole. My opponent begins by stating evidence to support his minor claim. He states that the total area of Anwar is 19 million acres large, and the drill site would consider 1.5 million acres, or 8% of the land, and of this 1.5 million acres, only 2,000 acres will actually be used for drilling. If drilling were to take place, the remaining 17.5 million acres of land would permanently be closed to preservation. While this quote is good, he doesn't cite it at all, so the credibility is questionable. He also follows with a Fox News quote stating that Alaska has 141 million acres of protected land, an area equal to the size of California and New York combined. This quote simply restates the previous evidence stated in a circular reasoning fallacy. There is no reason or warrant to prove how the importance of a drill site that is small compared with all of Alaska actually affects the environment. It is assumed by the last statement that he uses, which was, when the 2,000-acre drill site is compared to Alaska as a whole, it is only a fraction of the land mass. For the second secondary claim, oil drilling will have a negligible effect on wildlife in Anwar. According to Anwar.com, the Central Arctic caribou herd migrates directly through the Prudhoe Bay oil fields, has grown from 5,000 animals in the early 70s to well over 66,000 animals today. However, my opponent used the same source and same statistics, but the numbers were really different. He found that the animals grew from 5,000 to 32,000 animals. 66,000 is almost double what my opponent found, which could have strengthened the argument. What my opponent also failed to mention was that there's even people living in Anwar, and they could be directly affected by oil drilling too. My opponent uses a parallel case to reason with the audience. The parallel case was another drill site in Prudhoe Bay. The argument would be a lot stronger if more examples were given to prove that because it happens in Prudhoe Bay, it will happen in Anwar too. According to Shane Burley, an Oregon University graduate in journalism, degradation of this kind would rip land used by polar bears and around 180 species of birds, not to mention a vast number of migrating animals. Any kind of tampering like this would completely defeat the purpose of Anwar. We have already eliminated almost all the pristine and wildlife areas of pure nature in the country, and it would be a terrible fate if this one started to go as well. Technology, the third secondary claim was technology improvements to machinery significantly reduces the amount of pollution that is emitted into the environment. My opponent supports this claim with an uncited source, saying that improvements in technology allow for more drills to be placed on a smaller piece of land for excavating oil to be a quicker process. And once drilling is finished, oil fields are able to remove all traces of development and replant vegetation, as was the case for Kaktovik oil field when drilling ceased in 1986. This undermines the claim because we do not know where the information came from, and the audience is left to assume it's a generalization. My opponent fails to reason how drilling actually pollutes the environment, just how the technology works and its efficiency from old technology to new technology, and the audience is also left to figure out how drilling for oil actually pollutes the air and the environment and the land. Craig C. Friedrich, who has a PhD in physiology, writes a science article about how Anwar works. He states that oil drilling and extraction aren't clean activities, and there is a possibility of a large oil spill. In March 2006, a corroded pipeline dumped 200,000 gallons of crude oil into the tundra at Prudhoe Bay. BP Oil pleaded guilty to a federal misdemeanor over the spill and was fined $20 million. The worst fears that an accident oil spill could permanently devastate the Anwar environment. In conclusion, Anwar drilling would have a negative effect on the land, wildlife, and even the people that live there. Drilling in Anwar would destroy the refuge's natural purpose of preserving wildlife and animals. We want to help animals thrive and save this beautiful land, not destroy even the 2,000 acres they want to drill on.
All right, the structural stuff is fine. On the first point, your challenge is mostly to the ambiguity of the advocate's citations, and that becomes a theme that comes up several other places in the speech. I think that that's a reasonable press to make, but by itself, I'm not sure that it undermines the ability to make an inference on that evidence. If you had some evidence that was particular on the same points that reach a different conclusion, and you can compare the authoritative nature of your evidence to the abstract nature of the advocate's evidence, I think that would make your argument a little bit stronger. In a couple of other places, you had some evidence, for instance, on the second point in particular, where you're talking about what the impact would be, but it was an even broader kind of quote. Although you gave us a good authority on it and you qualified who the person was, the conclusion is much broader. It's not particular to drilling or to this particular area. It's kind of speculative. So by comparison, I'm not sure that you're helping yourself very much with that. Argument about the numbers on that second point, suggesting that the numbers don't really matter. Well, you need to tell us why they wouldn't matter, why any spill is significant and important. Later on the last point, for instance, you've got some information about an oil spill in Prudhoe Bay and a fine that was paid. There's no evidence that there was a consequence here. We go back up to that earlier point and you say, well, if something happened, it could be catastrophic, and we're looking at an incident that you are then drawing a parallel to, but you're not telling us it's catastrophic, so you need to develop that point a little bit. The same kind of argument about the ambiguity of the evidence is on the technology point, and I thought that you had an okay press on this, but once again, some counterclaim information would be helpful here, and this is where you have the argument about the oil spill at Prudhoe Bay and needed that follow-up that showed us what the damage was. And for instance, if it's a small spill and it had a huge amount of damage spread over a large area, then that would show us, for instance, why the numbers thing on that second point didn't matter as much. So I think that there's some information that's missing there. All right, thank you.